I'm drawn to the words in the 1 Samuel text this week. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. The story goes on to say, in essence, that in those days it took a while before a person who was being called by God realized it. It seems familiar. Since the beginning of October, we have offered a contemplative prayer service on Sundays at 10 a.m., and since the middle of November, it's been offered online. The online version, I've got to admit, has exceeded my expectations. You might think that getting on Zoom, muting your mic, and praying with other people on Zoom with their mics muted wouldn't do much, but I find it is actually substantially different from praying alone. It's easier to be still. This week, I've also found that I can't get through the day without some silence in prayer. I know you wish I did this every week, but this week I couldn't get through the days. I've been too agitated. The angst builds and builds until I take some time to be away from inputs and simply be with the divine. And in these defined times of prayer, the ones in the contemplative prayer service, as well as the ones I've taken out of my own need, I've been reminded of some things that I'm quite embarrassed to admit that I've forgotten. Or perhaps this is being kind with myself. Perhaps I didn't forget, but they came as reminders when other things had started to take precedence in my being. So, are you ready for my reminders? First, God is still there. Or rather, here. I'd really like to claim that I never forget that. But every time I settle into prayer and I sense the peace that passes understanding and grace which abides, I'm a little bit surprised all over again. Maybe this is because God's goodness is just better than I'm ever able to remember. But I admit, each and every time I encounter it, I am profoundly relieved it's still there. Second, stillness is possible. It often feels impossible until it actually happens. I get drawn in to the news, to the COVID statistics, to my own to-do list, and I get distracted by baby cries and baby squeals and emails and text messages, and it can seem like the whole of life is carefully created to keep me from finding stillness, or at least give me very good excuses about why I don't find it. And then when I do, it's still there waiting for me. And stillness is glorious. Third, and this is my final continual surprise, there is a vibrant, thriving, almost tangible connection between me and all living things and the living God. When the noise of the world isn't in the way, even right now, the spiritual wonder is breathtaking. Perhaps these reflections are able to serve as a reminder to you of things you also already know. Or perhaps they serve as a reminder of a need to find time for contemplative practice and stillness. For me, these moments of prayer serve as a source of transformation. My emotional responses to the world right now are sharp. I'm horrified and terrified and disgusted. And then closer to home, I'm also delighted and exhausted and grateful and worried and relieved. And all together, it's a lot to hold. So I've been thinking about the retreat we did in 2017 with Bishop Susan Hassinger, looking at spiritual practices that uphold social justice work. This might also be called grounding for the building of the kingdom, or following the way of Jesus without burning out. The needs of social justice work, of kingdom building, are so big that I'm overwhelmed by them unless I get grounded in the unfailing love of the divine. Worse, in this moment, I'm finding it easier to get pulled into the polarization of our society, and polarization inherently demonizes the other side. This is a big problem, especially for one who seeks to be a Jesus follower. So, are you ready for today's challenge? One of the great interpreters of the life and teachings of Jesus in our whole tradition, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote, "To our most bitter opponents we say, we shall match your capacity to inflict suffering by our capacity to endure suffering. We will meet your physical force with soul force. Do to us what you will, and we shall continue to love you. We cannot, in all good conscience, obey your unjust laws, because non-cooperation with evil is as much of a moral obligation as cooperation with good. Throw us in jail, and we shall still love you. Send your hooded perpetrators of violence into our community at the midnight hour and beat us and leave us half dead, and we shall still love you. But be ye assured that we will wear you down with our capacity to suffer. One day we shall win freedom, but not only for ourselves. We shall so appeal to your heart and conscience that we shall win you in the process, and our victory shall be a double victory. I feel quite confident that the most bitter opponents of the work of Reverend Dr. King and the Kingdom have been hard at work in our society, and their work has exploded into violence, death, fear-mongering and the disruption of our very democracy. Reverend Dr. King worked against the forces of white supremacy by working for the full humanity of all people. And that man, that wise, prophetic man, that man whose life itself was taken by the violence of the world, he is the one who said, "Do to us what you will, and we shall continue to love you." He refused to face violence with violence. He believed that the Jesus movement was founded on non-violence. He refused to meet hate with anything but love. Now, of course, love does not mean compliance. Love means naming evil. Love means good analysis of power dynamics. Love means strategic planning of protest. Love means taking care of people's spiritual well-being so they can keep on working for God's greater good. Love does not require us to back down. Love does not require us to become passive. And love does definitely not require us to be silent. But love does require us to seek the well-being of all of God's beloveds. And dear ones, this week, that reminder means that we have to include people who are part of white supremacist groups, people who are part of QAnon cults, and even the people who use those people to gain or keep power. Love requires us to want what is good for them. Although, thank goodness, that doesn't include that they get to keep power or continue using violence. Perpetuating violence hurts both the one who is violated and the one who violates. There is no goodness nor love in violence. But following the way of Jesus, the non-violent, loving way of resistance, builds the kingdom. You may remember the admonition in Matthew to turn the other cheek. It goes like this. "But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well." Walter Wink's teaching informed me that these teachings are ultimately nonviolent, loving resistance. In those days, there were two forms of striking a person, one used for equals and one for inferiors. A backhand for inferiors and a slap for one's equals. The left hand was never used because toilet paper hadn't been invented yet. To turn the other cheek is to respond to the diminishing insult of the backhand with an offer to continue violence that requires naming one as an equal. Similarly, the Hebrew Bible forbids anyone from leaving another person naked in the process of seeking loan repayment. So if a person seeking restitution of a loan demands one's outer garment and you offer your inner garment as well, you put them in the situation of having to refuse to take both or standing in violation of religious law. Jesus is good at this. I sort of wish that today's gospel lesson has the question, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Asked to Jesus himself, but Matthew does pretty well with it anyway. The answer of the whole book is yes! And the person asking the ignorant question is immediately aware of his error. Loving nonviolence, in this case, includes seeing the world and its locations anew. I'm a little bit concerned that because I have focused on spiritual grounding for kingdom building and nonviolence resistance as the means of kingdom building, that someone might not have heard me speak imperative truths. So I ask you to give me a moment to be abundantly clear. People who perpetuate violence in the name of Christianity are not following Jesus. Christianity itself has been profoundly co-opted by white supremacy in this nation and many others, and it is our obligation to continually root it out, transform it, and be self-aware of how it is living in our own lives and the lives of our communities. The violence we have seen in terms of mobs attacking governmental institutions in this country are the angry expressions of mostly white, mostly men who believe they have the fundamental right to be more important than others. Like any other abuser, they are most violent when they fear they are losing control. And they are losing control. And they are terrifying as such. The progress we have seen in humanizing people from the full range of humanity is not guaranteed to continue. Those angry, abusive mobs have friends in very high places and a whole lot of backers. And more important than all the rest, God is always, always, always on the side of full and abundant life for all people. So that's the side we are on. We don't want power consolidated with mostly white, mostly men, because no one group is able to adequately seek the good of all groups. It is only through shared knowledge, shared resources, and shared power that we can adequately seek the common good. And that is why I want us grounded in contemplative prayer, in good analysis, and in God's grace. Because I believe those are means of countering the insidious voices of white supremacy and its close cousin, the patriarchy. To move towards the kingdom requires seeing clearly what is happening and letting God's love transform us and the world through us. So, dear ones, please find the time to connect with God's grace. Allow grace and love to fill you up. Let Reverend Dr. King's reminder of the way of Christ continue to challenge you. And please recommit to the nonviolent way of Jesus. And may God grant us wisdom for the facing of this hour. Amen.